Well, good morning. I'm Chicken Johnny, and you're in the garden with Chicken Johnny. In the background, you can hear my geese, Chalveston and Hank. They'll probably quiet down a little bit when we get out to the garden. Today, we're going to take a tour of the garden, but we're also going to talk about weeds because it's July, and right about the 5th or 6th of July, weeds take off. Now, I had to go out of town for a short period of time, and I came back to a really weedy garden. You saw that in the last garden video. I'll put a link to that at the end of this video so that you can watch and see what a difference has been made in the garden. But we still have some weeds, and in fact, with our method of gardening, we're always going to have some weeds. Well, let's go to the garden and take a look. As you walk through the garden, we'll notice the beets. There's a lot of red root pigweed that has to be pulled. I got most of it out of the first two, or the second, third bed, but this first bed actually has quite a few in it. As we come down here, this is the Cayuga beets, and they're starting to get weeds in them. This is the kale. Kale creates a pretty good canopy that smothers the weeds out. This is also kale with a little bit of Swiss chard. And then this area here was peas, but the peas are finished. So now we're going to come through with our second planting of zucchini, and I'll be doing that a little bit later today. This is our shallots. Here's the eggplant, and down there is Brussels sprouts. There's some zucchini. Over that way you'll see a field of watermelon and cantaloupe. Those are just starting. All the way in the back there you can see some beautiful squashes, and then we get into the peppers. What I wanted to talk to you about today, though, is weeds. There's a lot of different kinds of weeds, but there's really only 5 things you can do in the garden with weeds. First, you can pull them. The sweet potatoes, they were all clean on Monday. This is Sunday, so 1 week ago. We've got to get in, and there's a lot of hand picking that has to be done. The benefits of hand picking is that you get most of the weed, and it probably isn't going to come back quite as soon. The problem with pulling weeds is you don't always get the root, especially if the plant has a tap root. Fibrous roots don't usually, although there are exceptions, don't usually grow back from the roots. So pulling out things with fibrous roots tends to work out okay unless it's grass. You can almost never pull grass out. The second thing you can do to get rid of weeds in the garden is to cut them out. Now, probably the most common way of cutting out weeds is using something like this, a hula hoe or an action hoe. Now, depending upon the ground, if the ground is dry enough and you use an action hoe, you'll really cut the weeds off, and you can do it quickly. And certain things like grasses, you're really just mowing the lawn. Even pigweed's going to come back from the taproot. So when you hoe with a hula hoe, it's part of maintenance. It's not ending a problem. Probably my favorite hoe is this spade hoe. I've got another one that I got from my grandfather, or actually my father got it from his father, and I got it from my father, so I guess roundabout I got it from my grandfather. But this is a spade hoe, and it's got a couple of different surfaces that you can use to sort of pull weeds and scrape them off the surface and dig them out a little bit. But the most important new addition to my garden this year, and the thing that is probably the most effective at removing weeds, is this tool right here. This was custom built. It connects to the 3-point hitch on the tractor. I've got a set of gauge wheels. So I set this device so that these cutting blades sit right at the surface of the soil. About 1/4 to 1/2 an inch below the soil is perfect. Now the operator sits in this chair here, and by pulling these arms back and forth, he can move that blade in and out. At the moment, I've got those locked off for traveling. But what this tool allows me to do is go through the field, riding directly on top of the crop, and cut those weeds out. Now, if the ground is a little bit wet, that tool actually will pull a lot of the weeds. But we've been using that around our peppers, and we've used it around some of our cole crops and the cucurbits and so forth. I plant my beets far too close together to use a cutting tool like that. So what are the positives of cutting? Well, the positives of cutting is that it's very quick. A lot of the weeds, if you go through once a week, or maybe every week and a half you go through the garden, you will disturb enough of the soil that you'll really reduce the weed pressure to begin with. And that brings me to another point. The best time to weed a garden is when you don't see weeds. When the weeds have gotten to this point, there's not much you can do but just pull and pull and pull. But you see the inner weeds, there's some in there. If you're looking close, you'll see them. I see them as we're walking through. Those sunflowers aren't weeds, they're plants that I've permitted to grow in the garden. And that leads me to another point. What is a weed? Well, if you talk to most people, they'll say a weed is a plant in the garden, or a plant in a place that you don't want it to be. And to a certain degree, that's not a bad definition of a weed, but it's missing something. A weed is actually a plant where you don't want it because it's causing competition for the crop that you've planted. Now, there are certain plants that I leave. I leave a few sunflowers. The reason is, once the sunflower seeds are available, birds will come in. And those birds will eat not just my sunflower seeds, but they will do a tremendous amount of insect removal. The third way you can manage weeds or control weeds in your garden is to smother them. Now, how do you smother the weeds? Well, there's a whole bunch of different methods. You can use plastic mulch. I did a whole video on why I no longer use plastic mulch, so you may want to check that video out. You can use wood mulch, kind of like what I did in the tomatoes. You notice that I spread that mulch out, and I'm hoping that that will help keep the weeds down in the tomatoes. Tomatoes take a lot of time and care, so I'd like to not have to be weeding them on a regular basis. Tomatoes are also a long-term crop, which means you plant them, well, we plant our tomatoes usually around Memorial Day. They've already been planted in the greenhouse, sometimes as early as March. So it's a long-term crop. It's a big investment. We get a lot of requests for tomatoes. Tomatoes become a very important crop to us. So we want to take good care of them, and investing a little bit in some mulch is not a bad plan. But I don't want mulch, say, in my acorn squash. Now, here's two really nice stands of acorn squash. I'm watching these very closely to see if I get any mosaic or any kind of downy mildew on them. And I'm actually seeing a little bit of downy mildew. Ironically, I'm seeing it out at the front. So I'm going to wait a little bit on that, maybe investigate it a little bit further. But I planted these very thickly in the field, and I'm just looking real quick to see. I think we've got a lot of flowers, but no fruit forming yet. Now, this is going to grow in, and it's going to be hard to get in here and pick out my acorn squashes. But the point that I want to show you, there's a few little blades of grass in there. They're not going to do very well. They're going to be completely eliminated because the crop canopy is going to smother out the weeds. And that's an important plan, especially in viney crops. Viney crops will do well with that. And that's why the kale was doing so well. It created a good canopy and it smothered it out. The other way you can smother weeds, and this really isn't smothering, and somebody might take, kind of argue this with me, but you can flame your weeds. And what flaming does is it causes the proteins to converge and go down to the root, and it kills the plant. It kills the plant really by smothering it, not allowing the plant to get the nutrients it needs. Now, some people will talk about you can control weeds by using drip tape. I've seen a number of videos this year kind of saying that drip tape will take care of your weed problem or cut down on your weed problem. Now, I suppose if you're in a dry climate, that may be true, and certainly there are different ways to take care of things in different climates. But what I've found is that drip tape, it gets in the way more than anything else, because when you go to try to cultivate weeds intra-row, you're going to nick the drip tape, and I find myself getting very frustrated with that. I think in the future I'm going to try to bury my drip tape quite a bit deeper than I have and see how well that works. I find the drip tape is most important in the early stages of crop development, and in the Midwest, Zone 5B, I don't really have a problem getting moisture. We get quite a bit of rain. We sometimes have a drought in August, so I have to take my overhead sprinkler out and hit the ground a little bit with that. I don't generally have to do much of anything. Our water table's pretty high here. In fact, too much water is more of a problem than not enough water. Some of the drawbacks, though, to weed fabric is, number one, it actually makes every other process in the garden just a little bit more difficult. It makes planting quite a bit more difficult. And the little bit of weeding that you are going to have to do, like right around the plant, and oftentimes you'll have to do a little weeding where the fabric joins. And if you're using plastic mulch that was laid with a mulch layer, it's very difficult to get the weeds out at the edge of the plastic mulch. And you're going to have weeds there. And when you weed it out, you're going to tear that plastic mulch, and then weeds are going to come up through. I also have chickens and mosquitoes, but I also have chickens that come into my garden from time to time, either intentionally or because chickens are chickens. And they have a tendency of puncturing a lot of holes down into my fabric. And so I tend to try not to use fabric. And the chickens, as they poke around, obviously they tear that plastic up. And then at the end of the year, you've got to do something with all that plastic. Now, woven weed fabric probably works a little bit better, and especially if you've got a small garden where the fabric, oh, look at that, a cucumber. Actually, it's a pickling cucumber. A little large, but that's all right. So there's a number of ways you can smother weeds, and as I showed you in the tomato garden, we're putting down some mulch, and that some wood mulch, and that can help. But there's benefits and drawbacks to a lot of this stuff, and one of the main drawbacks to mulching is it makes it a lot harder next year when you go to put in your garden. In my case, I'm going to have to remove all of that mulch unless I decide to incorporate it and try to go from there. Hey, look at this. This is one of my favorite plants to grow. It's a cabbage plant, and it is just starting to form a cabbage down inside there. Today's a nice cool day, so it should be helpful for these cabbages. I've got about 70 of them right now, and I've got another grouping of cabbages that'll plant probably in 2 weeks, maybe 3, and we'll see how that goes. The way I smother plants out, the mulch that we have there in the garden, and then I do use some landscape mulch in areas or woven garden fabric in areas where the weeds themselves are the only thing in that area. So for example, at the headlands of my tomato field, I have a lot of problems with weeds growing in, and I would have to manually remove those. So rather than doing that, I go ahead and put a little woven weed fabric there, and that'll stay down for 5 or 6 years. I won't need to do anything with it really, other than probably sweep it off so I don't get a lot of dirt built up on there and start getting plants above the fabric. The fourth thing you can do, and this is something that I might get a little flack from, you can use poisons. And I do use a little bit of weed killer. I use it in 2 places in the garden at different times, and then I use it in the fields around the garden, or rather by my buildings and things like that. So around my buildings I use 2,4-D. You have to be a little bit careful with 2,4-D because it'll volatilize on a hot day. But if you spray it early enough in the spring, just after the weeds emerged, that's the only place where you want to let the weeds actually emerge. I have no choice in my garden. It's so big that I have emerged weeds all the time. But if you're going to use chemicals, you have to wait until the weeds emerge, and then you can spray them and kill them. There are some pre-emergents that can be used, like Treflan is a good pre-emergent. Be very careful with Treflan. If you rotate your garden, you have to make sure that what you're going to plant there next year can grow in the residue left behind from the Treflan or trifluralin. The product name that you'd probably be used to is Preen. But Preen is trifluralin, and you cannot grow beets in ground that was treated with trifluralin. Now I've heard people say 12 months, and I've heard people say 4 years, but my personal experience is if you've treated ground with trifluralin, you're not going to plant beets. Now you can plant sugar beets, but we're not feeding horses and cows. We're raising beets for human consumption. And so you don't want to plant red beets or eating beets, table beets, let's say, in a garden that has been treated with Treflan. The other time I use chemicals in the garden is for grass. If I hadn't treated this area with some kind of weed killer, some kind of grass out weed killer, I would probably have enough grass in this garden to mow it right now. After only a week, I would have 2 or 3 inches of grass. I don't know if that's something particular to my area or particular to the garden that I have or particular to my cultivating practices, but I do use a product to eliminate weeds in my, or grasses in my garden, and the product is called clethodim. That's the chemical, and the name of the product is Grass Out, and I get it from Do Your Own Chemicals over the internet. Now, if I didn't use it, I don't think I could garden like I do. I don't think I'd be able to reach the scale that I garden at. And it has no effect on the broadleaf plants. I can spray them right over anything I have in the garden, even my alums, my onions and my shallots. It doesn't seem to hurt them at all. I was really nervous about spraying them over onions. No problem. Now you can't use it in sweet corn. Sweet corn's a grain. You can't use it on any grains because that's what you're destroying. The fifth thing you can do is just leave the weeds, man. Commune with nature, dude. was watching a hugelkultur guy talking about how he just leaves the weeds in his garden because then the insects will eat his weeds instead of his vegetables. Now, I don't know what part of the country he was in, and I don't know what kind of weed bank he has in his garden, but I'll be perfectly honest with you. If you leave the weeds in your garden, next year you're going to have 10 times as many weeds. And that's probably an understatement. You'll probably have 100,000 more weeds. And each pigweed plant, for example, they say average is about 500,000 seeds in a pigweed head. And pigweed will seed 4 or 5 times a year. So those seeds from the pigweed that you left from this year early will give you seeds already this year. Now you got to get the weeds out of the garden. Well, listen, I hope you enjoyed the tour, and I hope you enjoyed my random thoughts on weeding. But here really are the 4 things you can do to eliminate weeds in the garden. You can pull them, you can cut them, you can smother them, and you can poison them. Now there's some other methods, I'm sure. Leave your favorite method in the comments below. Comment on what you think. If you've got any advice for me, I'd love to hear it. I've been doing this for a while, but I can certainly learn new things. I hope something that I have said or something that you've seen during this video will inspire you to do something. And maybe you'll go out and plant a garden. Or maybe you'll go to a farm market and buy some vegetables from someone who's gone out and planted them and grown them, and maybe you'll have a greater appreciation for the effort and the work that that person put into growing those vegetables. And if so, maybe instead of asking for a better deal on his product, you might shoot him a couple of bucks a tip. Just say, hey, these beets are great. Here's a couple extra dollars. I appreciate what you're doing. I work every single day to try to keep this garden as weed-free as possible and try to get the fruits harvested at the peak moment and try to get them into the refrigerator or into the dark room or into the cool room so that they're ready and fresh and in the best condition they can be in for my customer. And that costs a lot more than I charge. Hey, Emitzer Shem, we'll see you again. I'm Chicken Johnny. Eat your vegetables.